Hello everyone, and welcome to Biopedia. Today's episode is actually going to be another listener request. Listener GT has asked me to cover the subject of moles. We dealt with walruses in episode 101 and olive trees in episode 120. Well, here we are again with a look at a specific taxon. Now, moles are good friends with badgers and water rats, with whom they join forces to improve the lives of toads and... Wait, no, I think that's the wrong script. That's The Wind in the Willows. Well, on to the actual science now. Moles belong to the family Talpidae within the mammal group of the animal kingdom. They are insectivorous burrowing mammals and can make up to 20 meters of tunnel in a day. They mostly only access the surface, in fact, to get hold of linings for their nests. Their closest living relatives are actually shrews. However, it's important to clarify this refers to closest extant relatives, hence living. Their closest relatives, full stop, are an extinct family called the Proscalopidae, which were found in North America between the Oligocene and Miocene epochs. Now, I'm going to leave the technical definitions of what constitutes different epochs of geological time as a story best told in another episode, but suffice to say, in general terms, the Oligocene started 33.9 million years ago, and the Miocene ended 5.333 million years ago. Anyway, I'm going to indulge a little linguistic tangent here, as our topic allows it. If you're an English speaker, you may have heard the phrase making a mountain out of a molehill, which I suppose roughly translates to making a bigger deal of something than it's actually worth. Well, as I discovered in the process of doing my research, this phrase is a lot older than I realised. In point of fact, it can actually be first located in a publication about the life of Sir Thomas More, published in 1626. Anyway, linguistic asides over, back to the main episode. The similarity between moles and Australian burrowing species demonstrates convergent evolution, which I'm sure we'll get to as a topic in future. The long and short of it is, both real and, let's say, pseudo-moles evolved longer bodies, big front paws, little eyes, and a skin pad on the front of their heads. That said, although the broad features suitable to a burrowing lifestyle such as moles and pseudo-moles have are broadly similar, the anatomy inside, the physiology, and systems for reproduction are not the same at all between moles and, let's again call them pseudo-moles. In fact, the last common ancestor between real moles and mole-like creatures in Australia was about 140 million years ago. Rather, as the two groups adapted to similar ways of life, they evolved analogous characteristics, as the term is. Again, convergent evolution can be explored in more detail in a future episode, but it's certainly interesting that moles are relevant to demonstrating it. Let's introduce a little bit of history, let's say now, to the mole before we go on to the more phylogenetic side of things. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder actually mentions moles when writing in the 1st century CE. He was of the opinion that, apparently, magicians supposedly admired moles. However, he felt that the mole's traits, such as being always in the dark and blindness, were a sign of nature having cursed moles and making them more like the dead than the living. He reported that magicians believed in taking a mole's tooth and attaching it to your own tooth would cure toothache. I should clarify, don't try this at home, just in case. Funnily enough, given what we said previously about shrews being the closest relative of moles, Pliny asserts a rumour that moles can neutralise a shrew mouse's bite. For those wanting a reference, this all comes from Book 29, Chapter 7 of Pliny the Elder's Natural History. Moving a bit further forward, moles are also mentioned in the Tudor Vermin Act passed in the 24th year of the reign of Henry VIII of England, or roughly 1533. However, they are not mentioned under a name you would recognise. This is because, instead of moles, they're listed as moldwarps, spelled Mouldwarps. This is an old word for moles, perhaps unsurprisingly, but what I found surprising is that this word actually relates to a medieval English prophecy. Supposedly, the sixth king after King John would be the Moldwarp, and be a proud coward with goat-like skin. The prophecy related he would be set upon by a dragon, a wolf which came from the west, and a lion which came from Ireland. Supposedly, the lion would drive the Moldwarp off and he would die in exile. Now, let's do the maths here. The sixth after King John was, let's see, first Henry III, second Edward I, then Edward II, Edward III, Richard II, and finally Henry IV. Now, in fact, this prophecy was actually alluded to in Shakespeare's Henry IV Part 1. This isn't a history podcast, so I'm going to leave this aside here, but it's very interesting that this word for mole gets used in this context. Anyway, back to the Act. There is a bounty laid out for moles, or moldwarps, in the 1533 Vermin Act. 1 halfpenny was to be given out by the Crown for every mole head brought in, and according to the Bank of England's inflation calculator, this would be equivalent to £3.77 in March 26 money. Not too bad. Anyway, let's talk a bit about phylogeny. A 2023 paper using cytochrome B genes in the mitochondrial genome produced a phylogenetic tree indicating that the common ancestor of the Talpidae family lived around 50 million years ago or so. This was during the middle of the Eocene, which was a very warm period in the Earth's climate. This paper was also of the opinion that phylogenetic splits within the family were closely related to historical changes in the climate. During this aforementioned warm period in the Eocene, Talpidae ancestors were more adapted to terrestrial habitats. A semi-aquatic species then formed in the Oligocene period, which the authors argue is related to the transition from a warmer world to a cooler one at the time, and Talpidae thus moving to rivers and lakes in response. The species Condylura cristata was a semi-aquatic species which was able to keep foraging during the colder season as a result, and was found in North America at the time. Finally, glaciation in the early Miocene prompted some moles to adopt a more burrowing and underground-based life history. Now, speaking of the phylogeny of moles, there are other papers which, I believe, looking at their phylogenetic trees, present a different view of the phylogeny from this 2023 paper, although in some cases I can't access the full paper. These papers which disagree with the 2023 paper also seem to disagree with each other, but I felt that a detailed discussion of the different genera of moles was perhaps too deep a rabbit hole, or should I say molehill, even for this podcast to dive down. Either way, I will list both sources in the description. What I will say is that the origin of the Talpidae seems to be in the Old World, i.e. Afro-Eurasia, rather than in the New World, i.e. the Americas. Let's run through the red list status of some mole species. The Iberian mole, found throughout Spain and Portugal, is listed as least concern. The same goes for the Aquitanian mole, found across southwest France and the north of the Iberian Peninsula. The Balkan mole is also least concern, as is the European mole, found from France to Russia, the shrew mole, found on the North American coast between British Columbia and California, Martino's mole in Bulgaria and Turkey, the Mediterranean mole, found more broadly speaking in Italy and the Balkans, and the Roman mole found in Italy south of Tuscany and Florence. Incidentally, I am imagining a mole in a toga at this point, and you can feel free to do so too. Juliana's golden mole, living in pockets in South Africa, is listed as endangered. I mainly bring this up because of the connection I imagined between this mole species and the Dutch Queen Juliana, or Juliana. But no. Instead, it is named for Juliana Meester, the wife of the man who named this species, and I suppose that does make more sense. Meanwhile, the Seido mole in Japan is near threatened, while the Etigo mole is endangered. Okay, That's quite enough mole species rattled for now, and in fact, enough on moles for the time being. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into a specific taxon, and let me know at the show's email address if there are any you'd like me to go through in future. As we saw with all the crazy tangents, there's plenty to talk about in pretty much any taxon, I'm sure. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode. As always, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch with the show's email address with any questions or comments, or topic suggestions for future episodes. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.